Hello and welcome back for the last ever time to a very special final instalment of the 31 Days of Felissa Rose. Because today, now that we've been all the way through Felissa Rose's filmography, we're going to be counting down my own personal top 10 Felissa Rose performances of all time. So a few quick things to point out about this particular list. Number one, what this isn't is it's not a list of the top 10 best films that Felissa Rose has ever been in. If you want that, then you can go back through the last 30 videos that I've done and work out for yourself, because I've already rated each and every one of them out of 10, nor is it necessarily a list of 10 films where Felissa Rose has got a lead or a big starring role. Again, we've done the Felissa factor for each of the previous reviews, so you can work it out yourself from that. So, what exactly is this list then? Well, what it is, in my opinion, is it is a countdown of Felissa Rose's 10 best performances. The ones where I think that she does a really great job, no matter how small her part is, or how good the film she's acting in actually is. This is basically a summing up of the best bits of acting that Felissa Rose has ever done, 10 times where Felissa Rose was really at the top of her game. These are the films to watch if you want to see peak Felissa Rose. A word of warning, however. Unfortunately, I will be spoiling a few of these films because there's certain aspects to some of these films that I've had to stay away from in my earlier reviews, but I think that this is a good place to get into some spoilers. The reason is that in a lot of cases, some of Felissa Rose's best performances are the ones where she actually turns out to be the villain in the end. So if you don't want these films spoiled for you, then turn away now, because I will be telling all as and when necessary. And finally, this is a personal list, which means that you probably completely disagree with it. And if you do, then feel free to tell me your top 10 Felissa Rose performances, and then I will tell you why you're wrong. So, what say we kick things off, starting at number 10, To Jennifer and For Jennifer. Is this a little bit of a cheat already? Maybe it is, but it's also one of the only times that Felissa Rose has ever done a sequel playing the same character. That character is of course an actress called Jennifer, who turns up to audition for the part of Jennifer in two separate zero-budget indie sequels to Jennifer, first in Hunter Johnson's To Jennifer from 2016, and then again in 2018 with Jodie Barton's For Jennifer. These are basically little cameo appearances, but they're also some of the most enjoyable turns that Felissa Rose ever gives. Because these are both found footage films, it means that the performances are pitched in this kind of generally low-key realistic way, which means that getting to see Felissa Rose go fucking mental is extra memorable, especially as she gets the chance to really go off the fucking chain. Not once, but twice.
You're a fucking asshole, you know that? Do you even fucking know who I am? I'm the fucking Valtrex herpes girl! Fuck you and your fucking script!
Sorry.
And you know what? I read your goddamn script, and it fucking sucks! And this is what I have to say to your goddamn camera. Fuck you!
I'm so
Fuck
sorry.
both of
Oh
you!
my
No,
god. I
fuck
apologize.
yourself!
Have a great day. Oh my god.
Number 9, Deadly Little Christmas. A seasonal little slasher film from 2009, Deadly Little Christmas is this kind of very low budget effort from David Sterling Productions that sees Felissa Rose playing the mother of a troubled young man who killed his father in this kind of twist on the basic young Michael Myers tradition. For a film that's ultra cheap, Felissa Rose gives really good value for money in this one, especially I think in the last act, where we ultimately find out that Felissa Rose is actually the killer all along, and that she's been manipulating her son to take the blame. It's a very twisted part, and there's this kind of extended standoff at the climax where Felissa Rose and a lot of the rest of the cast she's acting with really manage to rise above the cheapness of the settings and deliver something that I think, against all the odds, has actually got quite a fair bit of emotional depth through it. And of course, it's always fun to see Felissa Rose playing the baddie, just because it gives her a license to play against type. This won't be the last film on the list with a surprise Felissa Rose's the villain twist, but it's a strong performance in a film that is otherwise probably likely to be overlooked. Number 8, Cold-Blooded Killers. Felissa Rose as a deadly assassin driving a car with a personalised number plate, sporting a badass leather getup, hacking off limbs, drowning women in public toilets, and generally gunning down everyone that gets in her way. What's not to like? I admit that Cold-Blooded Killers isn't the greatest film in the world, but I also have to admit that I really do quite love it, flaws and all, just because it's so unapologetically stylish and it goes all in on its own particular brand of mayhem. It's a bit of a stretch for this list because I admit that Felissa Rose isn't maybe always that convincing as a gun-toting mercenary on the warpath, but I love the fact that there's a film where she gets a chance to be just that. I think that in terms of sheer enjoyment, this is probably one of my favourite Felissa Rose performances, just because it's so different to what she usually does, and it's got such a great, campy, so fucking what attitude to it that I knew that there was no way in hell that I could not have Cold-Blooded Killers on this list somewhere. It's Felissa Rose at peak awesome. Number 7, Camp Dread. One of a few summer camp slasher films that Felissa Rose turns up in, Camp Dread is probably the best of them all. Playing basically this kind of version of herself if things had gone downhill after Sleepaway Camp, Felissa Rose here is this washed-up actress who appeared in director Eric Roberts' 80s slasher franchise and is along to show the ropes to a group of youngsters taking part in the summer camp reality TV reboot. The first of a few collaborations with the amazing B. Harrison Smith, Camp Dread, I think, is one of the best films on this list, and it gives Felissa Rose a chance to play with a lot of meta stuff, but there's also a lot more to Camp Dread than just basic winks and nods, and I think that Felissa Rose manages to be convincing as somebody who's got gravitas and charisma, as well as getting some strong dramatic moments and a really gruesome and really awesome death scene. If you've never seen any of these Felissa Rose films that I've been talking about before, I think that Camp Dread is probably one of the best places to start, because it's a great performance in a very solid and very entertaining film. Number 6, The Perfect House. Now, I admit, I really hate this film, which I've already spoken about in great detail. It's this nasty, sleazy, gruesome anthology film about innocent people being tortured by cackling scumbags and getting zero punishment. It's this comedically gruesome, bleak bit of edgelord torture porn. However, Felissa Rose appears in the third and last story in this film as the mother of a family being slowly and brutally tortured one by one, and maybe it's just because, unlike a lot of the rest of the victims, I actually know who Felissa Rose is, and she's somebody that I really like, but it seems especially painful to see her suffering in this one. It is a one-note part that basically calls for a load of crying and screaming, but there is something hauntingly tragic about Felissa Rose's performance here that I think really stuck with me. And whilst I would happily banish The Perfect House to the 9th circle of hell, I will say that this is one of Felissa Rose's most emotionally charged and effective performances. Number 5, Rootwood. A team of podcasters go down to the woods to make a documentary, then they end up getting fucked over by the very legend that they're out to document. Except there's a few twists, all of which revolve around Rootwood's big reveal, which is that Hollywood studio executive Felissa Rose is actually out to turn the podcasters' documentary into a snuff film of her own. So yeah, it's another film where Felissa Rose turns out to be the baddie at the end. She's basically got two scenes in this one at the start where she sends her gang off to the woods, where she's all kind of aloof and dripping with that kind of snobby diva energy. Then again at the end, where she basically turns into this maniacal cackling sadist. And I think that the reason this film is so high up in the list is because both those sides of Felissa Rose's character are perfectly balanced in their portrayal, despite being so very different, and I think that she's equally enjoyable doing either mode. Any film where Felissa Rose gets to have a crazy screaming fit always scores highly in my book, and you will appreciate her earlier scenes a lot more when you realise that it's all just this carefully contrived act. This is one of a few very nicely layered parts that Felissa Rose takes on, and I think that she is fabulous in this. Number 4, Zombie Killers, Elephant's Graveyard. So, moving on, we have got my favourite smaller part that Felissa Rose has played, and that is the character of Laia in B. Harrison Smith's Zombie Killers, Elephant's Graveyard, which is a pretty fun, fairly run-of-the-mill post-apocalyptic film about this small, rural community being torn apart by internal conflict, all whilst the living dead prowl hungrily around outside. I think this is, by far, one of my very favourite Felissa Rose turns, maybe just because, once again, it's a very unlikely part. The character of Laia is essentially the community's religious leader. She's this kind of dangerous preacher who's totally convinced in her own beliefs, and every second that Felissa Rose is on screen in Zombie Killers, she is magnificent. I think it's one of the few instances where she gets to do really quiet, intense stuff, which I always think is the best way to go if you want to be really scary. And there's an argument that Laia is Felissa Rose's best ever turn as a character that's genuinely disturbing. The sad thing is, that is a very, very small part, and I feel that there could have been a lot more done with that character. But Zombie Killers is a very busy film, so rather than being this kind of wonderful, charismatic villain, we basically have to settle for Felissa Rose being a very interesting background player. Had she been the film's main antagonist all the way through, which she absolutely could have been, then I think that this could have been even higher up the list, because I think that this is a very overlooked performance, and it is magnificent. Number 3, Camp Twilight. Back to summer camp this time around, and another slasher film that feels quite a bit like a kind of retread of Camp Dread, I've got to admit. Felissa Rose plays a school teacher shepherding this bunch of slightly unruly teens through the usual summer camp hijinks before people start getting bumped off. There's a few interesting things about Camp Twilight that means it's so high up on this list. Number 1, it's a film partly written by Felissa Rose, which means that she's getting a unique chance to actually shape her character. But more importantly, this is another film where Felissa Rose turns out to be the villain, and it's another chance for Felissa Rose to play a character that's actually got proper layers to it. The thing is, when we first get introduced to Felissa Rose's character, she's kind of bubbly and over the top, and she seems like this ridiculous cliché. But in the final act twist, we learn that there is actually a reason for this, and that Felissa Rose is actually playing a character that's very severely psychologically damaged. And in her villain reveal speech, she's actually really great and shows us that she's totally convincing as somebody very dark and very driven in a way that's got a lot more depth to it than some of her other villain reveals in the past. I think the most impressive thing here is that she justifies that kind of initial bumbling silliness and plays a character that's totally psychologically consistent, and I think that is pretty impressive in a film that's fairly cheap and frothy overall. I think this is, in my opinion, the most underrated Felissa Rose performance, and I think that it shows that she's still turning in really strong characterizations no matter what the film. Number 2, Victor Crowley. This one's pretty straightforward and probably the least surprising entry on this list, or maybe the second least surprising entry on this list. Felissa Rose plays a very over-the-top caricature of this kind of shrewd New York publicist, and she does it tremendously in a turn that's really, really broad, but somehow manages never to feel goofy or over the top. It is by far Felissa Rose's funniest performance and one of her most well-known films in general, and thankfully she delivers the goods. She doesn't have the most screen time, but she really meshes well in a film that is more or less consistently quite funny. Her death scene is not funny though. But that's the only sour note in this one, a rare excursion into a bigger budgeted franchise film, and one that shows that Felissa Rose is capable of being really funny, and she remains totally convincing and totally in character at all times. A lot of her horror comedies tend to have her playing straight, or else resort to kind of really crude, obvious, silly stuff, but I think Victor Crowley is, by far, one of Felissa Rose's best ever performances. Which takes us to number 1. The best Felissa Rose performance of all time. Can you guess what it is? Of course you can. It's Sleepaway Camp. Now, this might seem way too obvious, but let me just say that, as I've said before, way back in day one, this isn't a film that I'm blinded by nostalgia for. I'm not saying it's great because it's iconic, or because it's a part of that general 80s horror retro nostalgia zeitgeist that's so prevalent these days. It's not because it's Felissa Rose's first ever film, or because it's her best known film. I'm saying it because this is, without doubt, the best bit of acting that Felissa Rose has ever committed to screen, and because whatever else you want to say about Sleepaway Camp, whether you think it's just a cheap twist ending and a load of pervy shots of half-naked underage boys, to me, it's a film that works solely based on the fact that Felissa Rose is fucking incredible as Angela, one of the greatest child performances in horror film history. Every second that she's on screen, Felissa Rose is Angela, and that's no mean feat because it isn't the sort of part where, like a lot of the rest of the cast, the actor could basically play a version of themselves or a distinct character type. Angela is a unique construct, and she is the thing that makes Sleepaway Camp so watchable and so different from every other summer camp slasher film ever made. And that's one of the things that's so impressive, because 13-year-old Felissa Rose wasn't just playing the part of a character called Angela, she really did become Angela for this film, and the whole performance is just flat out perfect in every detail. And that's why, to pretty much everybody, Felissa Rose will always be known as Angela from Sleepaway Camp. Not because she's never done anything else that was as good, but because it was such a pure distillation of that character that it's unlikely that anybody else could ever see her and not think of that time when she was Angela from Sleepaway Camp. So there we have it then. Finally, we've come to the end of the 31 days of Felissa Rose, and I just want to thank everybody that stopped by and seen me struggling along churning out substandard videos as quickly as I can. Honestly, I hope you've had a good time. I hope you've learned something about the career of one of our most passionate and exuberant horror legends, the amazing Felissa Rose, and hopefully you'll continue to look out for her in the future. So it only remains for me to say a really genuine thank you to everybody that's joined me for this very special month in horror. It's been really very gratifying to hear what all of you have had to say, but it's time now to take a bow and to say that this has been day number 31, the last day of the 31 days of Felissa Rose, and it has been my privilege to take you on this very special journey. Please consider being nice to my channel, and I shall see all of you at some point in the future. All the best and a very good night to one and all.